In the previous video, we looked at 10 major categories of evidence discovered and deployed by scholars in efforts to solve the synoptic problem. I'm going to go ahead and do something that many who study the synoptic problem are hesitant to do. I'm going to grant all 10 categories of evidence. While we may at times have to agree to disagree about the best interpretation of the evidence itself is real, and I submit that a solid theory of the synoptic problem should be able to account for each of these categories of evidence. In this video, we're going to look at two arguments, sometimes raised in synoptic discussions, that I do not grant, because they are based on presuppositions rather than evidence. Argument number one, the argument from theological development. Over the past few centuries, New Testament scholarship has gone for some wild rides. One of them was the assumption that over the course of the first century, Christian theology was invented and reinvented over and over and over again, such that by the end of the first century, the mainstream view of who Jesus was nothing like what the apostles believed in the early 30s. This was a presupposition rather than a deduction from evidence, the text of the New Testament being the principal evidence. But the books of the New Testament don't come with dates on them, and so people with a theological axe to grind found that they could shuffle these books around the timeline fairly liberally in order to substantiate a favorite theory. The exercise would look something like this. These books have a fairly simple theology or a low Christology. That's a measure of how exalted a view of Jesus they portray. So we'll say these books were written early. These books have a high Christology and a more complex theology. So we'll say these books were written later. We'll make a trend. And by golly, if we have to pigeonhole a book into the right place on the timeline, sometimes in spite of all the other evidence, in order to make the trend work, we're going to do it. This is what John A.T. Robinson described as an a priori pattern of theological development into which they are then made to fit. This method did not allow a lot of leeway to the New Testament authors to write greater or lesser detail based on the audience they had in mind, or how much does the audience already know, or what is the occasion for writing. This method also had consequences for subsequent study of the New Testament, because some of these dates so invented stuck, or at least relative dates did, such that later generations of New Testament students would see, okay, I've been told these books were written earlier, and I see that they've got a fairly simple theology. I've been told that these books were written later, and interesting, they've got a more complex theology. There's a trend. I've discovered a trend of theological development in the New Testament. No, we haven't discovered anything. We just argued in a big circle. We started with the premise that this trend was there. We then imposed that trend on the chronology of the New Testament. People used the chronology we gave them and discovered the trend we put in there. One big circle, at times remarkably aloof from the evidence. Bridging this back to the synoptic problem, I find it intriguing that some scholars insist that Matthew and Luke must be dated after Mark because of their high Christology, while also acknowledging epistles of Paul with a higher Christology than Mark that were written before Mark. This is exactly the opposite of what the theory demands. Thus, what we see here is a case of forcing the evidence to fit the preferred outcome in theory, rather than molding the theory to fit the evidence. Critics have tried for years to find a roughly linear trend of theological development in the New Testament, and have been unable to produce one. Rather than a nice clean trend line, we get something that looks like it's more closely related to a sine wave. If this is the data I have to work with, I can't use that to determine the date at which a book was written. When we check our presuppositions against the evidence comes out on top. And we just don't have the first century evidence of clear trends in theological development to give us the chronological precision that is being asked of it. Thus, we cannot use this argument to determine the dates or the order of the writing of the Gospels. Argument number two, the argument from the prophecy of the destruction of the temple. All three synoptic Gospels record that Jesus predicted the temple in Jerusalem would be destroyed. This actually happened in 70 AD. Mark gives the least detail. Matthew and Luke give more. Some have said, well, Mark might have gotten some vague details right in advance, but Matthew and Luke, with that kind of detail, nobody could have known that in advance. They must have written after the fact to make it look like this was predicted in advance. This argument fails on two logical accounts. We'll also look at some evidence that argues exactly the opposite, that Matthew and Luke may well have been written before the temple was destroyed. Number one, the Bible is a book that purports to be full of prophecy from beginning to end. We cannot objectively evaluate a book about prophecy if we start with the a priori assumption that all prophecy is real or all prophecy is fake. To do so would be to restrict the possibilities we're willing to consider. And if we inadvertently restrict the truth from the possibilities we're willing to look at, we will be ever learning but never coming to a knowledge of the truth. To decide in advance on the very variable under consideration is to commit to a conclusion without even evaluating the evidence. If we start with the premise that the book is a fraud, of course we'll come to the conclusion that the book is a fraud. It's one of our premises, but we haven't proven anything. Again, we've argued in a circle. Second logical failing of the argument is that it does not interact with the possibility that we can account for these verses in Matthew and Luke without any appeal to the supernatural at all. This is not to take a position on prophecy. If Jesus is the Son of God, the idea that he could predict the future is not all that outlandish a claim. But just looking at the historical evidence alone, what we see is that this is not the only prediction of impending destruction on Jerusalem. Josephus records such a prediction. What we're left with is that somebody who was reasonably aware of the political realities of the time, they saw the friction between the Romans and the Jews, could see that this was not going to end well. This was going to break out into major violence. And the number one way the Romans could stick it to the Jews would be to destroy their temple. This would not be the first time the Romans destroyed a site considered sacred to others, and this would not be the first time that a temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. But what of the specific language in Matthew and Luke? Surely that's anachronistic unless it's written after the fact. On the contrary, this is language and these are motifs drawn from the Old Testament and 1 Maccabees, and there's nothing at all anachronistic about Jews prior to 70 AD citing words and phrases and ideas from the Old Testament and 1 Maccabees. Now let's briefly look at 4 lines of evidence. We'll focus specifically on the Gospel of Matthew, suggesting that it was more likely to have been written before the destruction of the temple than after. First, Matthew goes to great lengths to point out when a prophecy has been fulfilled. That's kind of his thing. After recording in detail this prophecy, to not follow it up with an exclamation point, look, it actually happened just like he said, if he's writing after it happened, is wildly inconsistent with the style of the author. Now you might say, well, that's a negative argument. Okay, let's do a positive one as well. Number 2, there are passages in Matthew that suggest that the temple is still standing at the time the document is written. For example, when Jesus speaks favorably of paying the temple tax, this is a reasonable thing to say. If the tax is funding the temple in Jerusalem, as it was prior to 70 AD. After 70 AD, however, this tax was funding the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. This was deeply aggravating to the Jews, whose money was being taken to fund a pagan temple, and there was nothing they could do about it. Matthew is by far the most Jewish gospel. The Jewish Christian gospel of Matthew has nothing to gain by including this passage if it's being written at a time when that tax on the Jews is funding a pagan temple, and at a time when Roman leaders have demonstrated their willingness to massacre Christians. Number 3, Matthew includes the warning, pray that your flight be not in winter. If you need to flee sometime in the future and you're not sure what time of year it'll be, that's a reasonable thing to worry about. But it does not make sense to include it after the fact. It would detract from the impact of the prophecy because everybody knew that Jerusalem was destroyed in the summer. Number 4, Matthew 22:7 has been cited as a proof text that Matthew must have been written after the temple was destroyed and the city was burned because it's a passage in which a city is burned. Well, of course, since Jerusalem in 70 AD is the only time in history that a city has ever been burned, it must be so. No, not even close. Unfortunately, many cities have burned in ancient and modern history. In fact, Rome itself burned in 64 AD. There's nothing in this passage to call out specifics of 70 AD. And if this were a reference to 70 AD, this would be a parable in which Caesar played the role of God. Given the great lengths early Christians went to avoid worshiping Caesar, this is not a motif that we should expect them to gratuitously put into their scriptures. What we see then is that this is a fairly general prophecy. It does not do exactly what you should do if you are making up a prophecy after the fact in order to make your religion look good. You want to nail precise details of what happened to impress people with how much your prophetic individual knew in advance. You don't want to keep it so vague that people could say, oh, well, maybe they got lucky by guessing. If Matthew and or Luke were trying to invent a fake prophecy after the fact, they completely failed to capitalize on a golden opportunity. These otherwise capable authors blew it. This is where the skeptics can't have it both ways. On the one hand, they want the gospel authors to be brilliant masterminds who pulled off the greatest conspiracy of all time. On the other hand, they want the gospel authors to be bumbling fools who make rookie mistakes like this one and others, who never developed a following of their own and disappeared themselves into obscurity. It's a double standard. what we find then in both the argument from theological development and the argument from the destruction of the temple is that they have more to do with a dogmatic fear of anything that smacks of the supernatural than they do with the evidence itself. The evidence comes out against them, and we cannot use them to reliably indicate the order in which the Gospels were written.